So my name is August Gorman. I'm at Princeton University, and my talk today, Neurodiversity and Responsibility for Omissions. Before I begin, I want to thank you and the other organizers for hosting this conference on what I think is a really interesting and important topic that is somewhat underexplored. So this is some new work for me that I'm presenting for the first time today. It's based on chapter 3 of a larger book project I'm working on neurodiversity and moral responsibility. But my talk today will in particular be about omissions. And so what I want to do is start with the idea, an idea that I'll assume and sort of make use of throughout my presentation, that when we praise or blame someone for their behavior, we do so in a way that takes their behavior to have expressed some further thing about them. So behavior for which we're responsible is appraisable on the basis of what it expresses. So something like this is part of several prominent kinds of views in the moral responsibility literature. There are some important differences, but I'll mostly gloss over those here for the sake of time. But I'll briefly sort of mention what these views are. So self-disclosure views, such as the one advocated by Harry Frankfurt, posit that when a person acts agentially, she identifies with elements of her psychology that then determine her behavior. So in intentionally acting on the basis of, say, a commitment, her resultant action is expressive of the value she places on that commitment. Conversational views, like the view of Michael McKenna, they see a person's moral behavior as making a sort of conversational move for which things like blame, excuse, praise, and so on are potential expressive responses. So these views will need to have a way to make inferences from a person's behavior to some expressive content. And finally, attributionist views, you can think of like Angela Smith's view, hold that a person's behavior is always reflective of their judgment-sensitive attitudes or their evaluative judgments or their moral personality in some sort of way. These views really prioritize the ability of agents to morally protest actions which seem to indicate a lack of care. Perhaps the foil to my view would be this attributionist view, but I take on a lot of the commitments of it nevertheless. So anyway, before I get ahead of myself, I think that we make these sorts of attributions that people's behavior expresses something about them quite broadly, but I think it's kind of easiest to see and it's most explicit in cases of responsibility for omission. So consider the example where someone forgets to call you on your birthday. You might think to yourself, ugh, she must not care about me as much as I thought, because if she cared enough about me, then she would have remembered my birthday. And in this way, you take her omission to in some way reveal or reflect or express or communicate, right? Something about her. You're making that inference. Okay. So with that on board, what I'm going to do today in this talk is raise a problem for what we might call non-derivative responsibility for omissions, at least in the way that it's usually proposed. So what does that mean? Let's contrast it with what we might call derivative responsibility for omissions. So when someone is derivatively responsible for an omission, they're responsible for what they don't do because or in light of some earlier thing that they did do that led to the omission. That's sometimes called a benighting act. So here are some standard cases. A person drives drunk and hits a mailbox. It seems that when we blame that person, it's not primarily for that driving decision made, right, when they approach the mailbox under the influence. Instead, we're really blaming them for the earlier decision to drink without a plan to get home safely or something like that. So another standard case of derivative responsibility could be a person who acts out of some sort of factual ignorance, but their ignorance is due to sort of like intentionally failing to educate themselves. So we're not thinking that the surgeon's wrong choice during surgery is directly revealing their character flaw. But if they spent their time before surgery playing a video game instead of learning the right technique to do that surgery, then we might think that choice does reveal it in light of that earlier act. So some people think that all cases of blameworthy forgetting, failure of attention, etc., are explicable in this derivative sense. But the idea that people are actually directly responsible for these kinds of omissions without being blameworthy for an earlier benighting act has lately been gaining a lot of traction. So these views kind of come in two flavors. So either the idea is that we can sort of directly read the quality of will off of behavior, like forgetting or not, not attending to something, or that it's fair to take a person's omission as a signal of their quality of will. In other words, it's fair to act as if that's their quality of will unless you're somehow told otherwise. So usually this takes the form of the inference that either a person's failure to act directly means that that person has failed to care, or it could take the form of the inference that a person's failure to act makes it so that you can reasonably assume that they failed to care. And either way, it's proposed that there's sort of, right, like a simple algorithm that brings you from the failure to act to the failure to care. But I think that we ought to be much more cautious in our interpretive inferences of this kind. So to put it as a slogan, failure to act does not equal failure to care necessarily, right? The relationship between failure to act and failure to care, I want to say, is not equivalent. There's no simple algorithm. Now, there is some correlation between the two, but we have to remember, and here's the key, that individuals have differences in things like memory, executive functioning, patterning of attention. So there just couldn't be a one-size-fits-all simple algorithm between failure to act and failure to care. That's sort of my main thesis here. Okay, so that's the basic idea, but here's sort of a possible rejoinder that I imagine many people might have. They might say, no, failure to act does indicate failure to care, but people just have a lot of excuses. So for example, you might think, look, it is reasonable to take failing to act as expressing a failure to care enough, unless someone, lets you know that actually it's just, oh, I just have bad short-term memory, or I'm just bad at focusing, or I'm having trouble keeping up as well as I should lately. I have bad long-term memory. I'm not good at being on time. I'm just not good at following through as much lately, right? But what I want you to notice is that all of these kinds of excuses have some sort of normative standard implied that's not being met, and it largely goes unspecified in this discourse. So a question that I think we need to ask here is, where do these normative standards come from? So if we lived in a world where everyone had, let's say, a much lower working memory capacity than the current average, would we be less likely to make these kinds of inferences? And if you start thinking that way, you might wonder, is it just minoritized forms of agential functioning that are counted as needing excuses simply because they're in the minority? And if so, I think that's a form of marginalization that we shouldn't accept within our theory, at least not without argument. Okay, so given that seems to be a fairly big problem, what I want to do now is diagnose two reasons that I think can partially account for why we've sort of been misled to believe in this simple picture of responsibility for omissions that neglects the need to look at variables in terms of agential functioning style. So one reason is that we take for granted that we can bracket off certain people as being truly dysfunctional and thus outside of our blame paradigm altogether. And I think once we do that, it makes it easier to make sweeping assumptions about everyone else. The other is that I think there's a feedback loop that results from neurodivergent people attempting to indirectly manage their behavior to match social convention, which then sort of cements the social convention, but I'll get to that. Both of these factors, I think in different ways, are products of and maintained by stigma. So I'll sort of dive into each one here. So the first reason I think that we're willing to think that failure to act equals failure to care, the fact that we bracket off people that we take to be sufficiently dysfunctional. I have much more to say about this in other parts of my book, and some of you have heard about. some of this other work I've done, but I think it's worth mentioning here too. So there are some people, it's assumed, who are dysfunctional to the point that we simply can't hold them responsible for what they do or don't do since they lack control. Our practices then only need to be made fair for normal people. On the dominant sort of difference as defect paradigm, we assume agents have certain capacities that are relatively homogeneous, except for aberrant cases. We can then talk about agents in general as a sort of shorthand for talking about people inside of that circle that I have in that diagram on the left. Right, and so the aberrant cases are just sort of outside of our paradigm. On a neurodiversity model, which I favor, we have to recognize the sort of messier truth that various kinds of agential functioning differ from person to person, and any generalizations we make about agents in general are apt to be exclusionary. So it's only on a differences defect model that we can come to make general pronouncements like, well, it's just not that difficult to remember your friend's birthday, or you should be able to get yourself out of bed to water the plants. Those, I think, are shoulds of ableist, agential normativity. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand why we might want to take on this differences defect paradigm, right? It's a simplifying assumption. And when we're theory building, we're going to be really drawn towards simplifying assumptions. But I think simply casting certain people outside of the domain of interpersonal responsibility just isn't a consequence without major social and political costs. So when you think about it, in this case, the implication seems to be that the behavior of people who are outside of this norm just doesn't express anything because they're not in control enough, but that's just not true. So I think another problem here is that this is going to tend to make people reticent to self-identify as part of the group excluded from the norm, and that's only going to serve to reinforce the stigma. Okay. So the second reason. Another reason why I think it seems that failure to act equals failure to care is sort of seems like a reasonable principle to us, is that there's a feedback loop for neurodivergent behavior. So let me explain. Start at the top here. Start with an interpretive norm for a certain kind of omission that assumes that people are neurotypical. So this would be an inference you could make to what a person's inaction would mean, just so long as we assume that person is neurotypical. Now, suppose the inference is that, in this case, not acting indicates a lack of appropriate concern for someone or something. Now, suppose that someone who's not neurotypical, a neuroatypical person's omission is now interpreted in line with this convention that was not really made with them in mind. Now, this person is then misperceived as having poor moral character on the basis of some omission. Well, what is this neuroatypical person going to do when that happens to them? I think they're going to learn that if they fail to act in these kinds of situations, their inaction will be perceived as indicating that they've failed to care enough, even though that's not actually the reason for their omission. They learn this as a life lesson, and so to avoid this outcome in the future, they'll want to try to manage these situations so that they're not interpreted as having poor moral character. So the neuroatypical person, often with great effort, acts to conform their behavior to match the good outputs of the interpretive norm that assumes neurotypicality. They can do this in a number of ways. So they can take on fewer obligations. They can use indirect strategies of management over their behavior. They can exhaust inordinate amounts of energy attempting to try to conform their behavior to the dominant norm. And the result is that, in fact, it works to some degree, right? They more often conform to the neurotypical norm, even though it's set only with neurotypical people in mind. Now, here's where it becomes a feedback loop. It now becomes somewhat reasonable, although very fallible, of a way of interpreting their behavior, right? Given that they've now done things to minimize failing to meet the norm, when they do fail to meet it now, it could indicate a lack of effort in that particular circumstance. Now, I want to hedge here a little. This isn't a great guide. So think of cases of forgetting. no matter how many indirect strategies you use, you might simply forget to implement, one of your strategies to remember things. If you don't have a high working memory capacity. Okay. But it does mean that even neurodivergent people often are conforming to this norm. Thus, the interpretive norm remains unquestioned. So now here's where bracketing off people deemed too dysfunctional and the feedback loops sort of work in tandem to maintain the status quo paradigm. In order to break the feedback loop, a neuroatypical person would have to be able to make their behavior intelligible to neurotypical people without making it seem like they're pleading the case that they're too dysfunctional to even be an agent. But given the status quo, the only options are you're in control enough and normal enough to be interpreted under the dominant convention, or else you're sort of a pitiable non-agent. And stigma, right, is going to maintain this paradigm because people don't want to explain how their agency works in another way, such that they end up putting themselves outside of the paradigm altogether. They also might turn the stigma inwards, right, and just see themselves as failing to live up to this norm. So stigma instead is going to lead to silent conformity, the burden on neurodivergent people to indirectly conform their behavior to neurotypical interpretive conventions ends up just sort of being made invisible. Okay, this all seems a little abstract. I'm now going to put some meat on its bones and give you a concrete example. Okay, so I'm going to use the example of ADHD task salience to demonstrate how this kind of feedback loop can work. So here are some assumptions that are often made given the status quo paradigm. So first, we bracket off dysfunctional cases. We think some people just have so much trouble focusing, right, that they can't be expected to direct their focus. So you shouldn't blame them because they can focus if they try. So if they fail to focus on something important, not their fault. You take everyone else, and interpretive convention with the extreme cases sort of bracketed off. We assume that all of the relatively normal people, and that's in quotes, are such that if they care enough about something, they'll direct their attention towards it. Now, this roughly divides people, right, again, into these two categories. Either a person is incapable of directing their agency towards what they take to be most important, or they're liable to be held responsible for failures of focus. They're responsible in the sense that their lack of focus indicates insufficient care, and they can be blamed on this basis. Okay, so that's sort of the status quo paradigm as I see it, but the reality I think is quite different. So first off, roughly somewhere between 5 to 10% of the population is estimated to meet the qualifications for diagnosable ADHD. And the way that attention patterning functions in ADHDers just isn't addressed by the dominant interpretive paradigm. So according to one leading theory that I find at least provides a helpful heuristic for thinking about these differences, distractibility in ADHD isn't about degree of control or lacking willpower. Instead, it's related to a different kind of functioning of involuntary working memory processes that affect task salience. So non-ADHDers will have their focus drawn towards what they take to be most important as a general rule, which will show up sort of as the most salient task to them. ADHDers, by contrast, naturally have their attention drawn towards what's most interesting to them, which may or may not align with what's important. They can try by various methods to make those two categories similar, but that's sort of an additional step. Like other kinds of agential differences, ADHD traits are not all or nothing. We might consider all members of the general population as a whole to exist somewhere on a spectrum of importance to interest-based focus. This is a very rough, general, heuristic kind of way of thinking about this. I'm not putting a ton of stock into the particularities of if we, really polled everyone exactly where they would be, but just try to follow me on this general way of thinking about this. Okay. So this means that the interpretive norm that failing to focus on something indicates that the person doesn't think it's important enough is only going to be accurate for people who are on the left part of that scale, where it's the important tasks, the tasks they take to be important, that sort of pop out as most salient. Okay, so back to that cycle. We have our interpretive norm for a certain kind of omission that assumes neurotypicality. In this instance, it's something like this. Failing to attend to X means that you don't think X is important. Then the ADHDer's failure to focus is interpreted according to that neurotypical norm. If the thing they were supposed to focus on was morally important in some way, they're now interpreted as not just failing to do the important thing, but also as not caring about the value of the important thing. And this is an upsetting charge for the ADHDer, presumably, and so they'll take steps to avoid this state of affairs in the future. Notice here, again, right, one way out of the cycle would be if they were able to explain that, look, due to the way my brain works, my lack of focus doesn't reveal that I didn't take this test to be important. And when I do that, right, the other people would understand that and appreciate it. But stigma, including self-stigma, often takes this option off the table. Instead, the ADHDer, assuming they do care sufficiently about expressing just how important this task is, will use workarounds. The workarounds make it so that the ADHDer more frequently is focusing on what they take to be important. So it could be committing to having to focus on fewer things. It could be artificially making important tasks more interesting in some way. These kinds of workarounds are not cost-free to the ADHDer, yet they remain fairly invisible aspects of how this person's behavior gets interpreted. But insofar as the ADHDer does these kinds of workarounds, they will be more likely to be interpreted as not caring as much if they don't succeed in focusing on something. Because if they did care, they would probably make sure to use their workarounds. This cements the interpretive norm, but the burdens of adhering to it are unfairly distributed among ADHDers and non-ADHDers. In other words, these attempts at conforming to the norm reinforce the feasibility of the norm and make its burdens invisible. Okay, so I'm just very briefly going to touch on my last slide here, which is fine because this is the least developed part of my project that I'm hoping we can talk about in Q&A. How then should we reconfigure our practices, given my concern about the unfair burdens of conforming to the current conventional norms? For one, we might question whether or not we really need to have an interpretive norm that's sort of a catch-all, or we can simply withhold judgment until we learn more about the other person's agential functioning. I think we need to think about the degree to which conforming to these norms might require introspective abilities or access to certain resources for self-understanding, tools for overcoming self-stigma that might be unjustly distributed among the population, and that I think needs to be part of the conversation, right? It's not the only part of the conversation. We also need to, we also need to think about why we have that norm in the first place and what other things we're balancing. But I think that's important. And not only finding a more just distribution in terms of a time slice property of the world, but I think we also need to think about what sorts of conventional norms are the way they are due to historical injustices? And do we have some sort of obligation to revise our norms in a way that helps offset the sort of historical injustices of how our conventions have been set in the past? And so with that broad and inconclusive ending to what I think we ought to do, I will open it up to Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, August. And we'll, if you stop sharing, then we will go to the Q&A. And I need to adapt my view.